Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Go for Growth webinar on social value for procurement and commissioners. Apologies for the slight late starting of it. We had a few technical issues this end. Technology is brilliant, but only when it works. But we are here now and we're ready to go. So we'll just cover some housekeeping things off whilst people are joining us, and then we'll do some introductions. So first thing, we are recording the session today. So a copy of the recording and a copy of the slide deck that Jimmy and I run through today will be sent out to all attendees. So please don't feel like you have to make tons of notes as we go unless you want to. You will get everything that we cover today. And we do try, although we are on a webinar in Zoom, we do try to encourage as much interaction as we can. So the chat functionality is enabled in the webinar today, as is the Q&A. So please feel free to say hi and introduce yourself on the chat if you would like to. If you've got any questions for either myself or Jimmy as we run through the presentation today, if you could put them in the Q&A, we'll keep an eye on them as we go, and we'll either answer questions as they come up if it's relevant to do so, or we have carved out a little bit of time at the end for Q&A as well. So we'll either catch them as we go or at the end. If we have got a lot to cover in 45 minutes today, so if we do run out of time for questions, if you do pop them in the Q&A as we go, if we can't get to them live today, we will always answer them when we send the slide deck out as well. So no questions will get lost. It just might be when we go through them. You can see on screen what we're going to try and cover today. So Jimmy and I will just do super brief introductions in a second. Jimmy is then going to cover an overview of social value, what it is in the context of procurement and commissioning. I'm going to cover the procurement context in more detail and using the procurement cycle, and I'm using the SIPS procurement cycle today, how we can approach embedding social value. And as I said, we've got some time carved out for questions in the at the end if we get there. So super quick, if you've been to a Go for Growth webinar before, you might know who I am already. My name is Gillian Askew. I'm one of 3 co-founders of Go for Growth, and I'm a procurement professional by trade. Coming up to my 30th anniversary actually in procurement, spent largely in both private sector and public sector. And I'm also a long-standing micro business social enterprise owner, bidding for public sector work. So, and I think I say that really just to demonstrate that I've walked a mile in both pairs of shoes. I've put procurements out into the market and I've also responded to them as a marketplace person as well. Jimmy, I'll hand over to you. Do you want to do your introduction?
Thank you, Jill, and good morning, everyone. Yeah, Jimmy Brannigan with Net Positive Futures. Worked a lot my whole life on sustainability, social value, corporate social responsibility. Currently working with around 60 universities on supporting supplier development on social value, as well as all of Blue Light services. I also spend a lot of time now supporting the development of the supply chain around carbon reduction with Jill. So yeah, happy to share whatever I can.
Perfect. Thanks, Jimmy. So we're over to you for the first part of this presentation anyway. So if you just let me know, Jimmy, when you want me to move on to the next slide, I'll do so.
Will do. Thank you very much. And as I just mentioned, I've been involved in sustainability, social value, corporate social responsibility for my whole life. Started at the Environment Agency. And what I've seen over the years is a development in the proliferation of language around this agenda. So we're talking about social value in procurement today. But this has, for the older among us, its roots back towards Agenda 21 when I used to work for the Environment Agency. And then it's morphed over the years in terms of whether it's corporate responsibility and corporate social responsibility in a private sector context, the rise of sustainability and sustainable development, and as we talk about now, ESG. And I'm currently doing a review for an organization on their ESG performance. So what we've seen is a proliferation of language. This has not helped. So whilst we're talking about social value today, what I want to do is put that in the context of this longer term agenda. So we've had this proliferation of language, but at the heart, it's always the same. And if we just move on, Jill, that would be great. So as I said, we're talking about social value, but within any of these language sets, it's the same core concept, which is about how, whether as an organization or within our procurement process, how are we embedding the sustainability, the environmental, social, economic impacts of what we do. And the language, just to finish on the language, as we can see, and what I've done in this slide is say whatever language set you use has pushed people towards a certain lens. So when we talk about social value, we're sort of drawn towards a socio-economic, and if we think about a geographical context with our local authority or our business, we're thinking about what's the value here, what's the value socially and economically. But the language of sustainability tends to put the environmental at the heart of it. So as a sustainability professional, historically and primarily, I was focused on, in effect, the protection of the planet, and how do you do that alongside the social and economic. So once again, just to finish on the language, regardless of whatever language you use as an organization, and it might be different in the organization to it is within the procurement context, then at the heart we're talking about the same thing. And that's what I wanted to emphasize here. And if we can just move on, Jill, that'd be great. There's a broader context I just want to refer to briefly. And when we're talking about our response as an organization to social value, it can be a myriad of issues. And I just wanted to, if you weren't aware, point out that something called the Sustainable Development Goals, which have been around for a while now. But what these do is highlight globally some of the challenges that we all face. And when they first came out, there was a lot of people saying, well, actually, yeah, but we don't have issues with hunger here in the UK, or we don't have issues with poverty. And I think I don't have to tell anyone online that these are not just third world problems, they're first and second world problems. So what we've got here is a myriad of issues that, as part of our social value agenda, we're trying to contribute towards. Now, we can't contribute towards all of them all the time, and that becomes a decision in the procurement process. But I just wanted to highlight that we have these SDGs, as they're called. So you might have heard the language, and your organization might be committed to supporting the alleviation of some of the challenges associated with this SDGs. And the point I want to make here also is that we've got these 17 SDGs that cover a myriad of interconnected issues. And when I look at it like that, it becomes overwhelming. And I ask the question, where does this fit with my concept around sustainability and social value around the economic, social, environmental? And if Jill moves on, we'll see that whilst you can look at them in that block approach, which is the most common delivery mechanism of the SDGs, when you break them down, they reinforce the core concept of environmental or biosphere here, as it's described, the social and societal issues, and the economic. It also highlights that actually this partnership approach at a country level, at a business level, across a council, across the sustainability and procurement professionals, that partnership approach is absolutely critical. The other thing I want to highlight here is that in terms of the environmental, there's placed at the base. Now, this takes us back to the language slightly around social value. I mentioned earlier that the language of social value draws us towards a socio-economic, and that's understandable and is important. But fundamentally, we need to protect the biosphere and the environment for the ecosystem services it provides. So just to emphasize that when you're thinking about social value in procurement, don't get drawn just towards it's about apprenticeships, it's about local economy development. Actually, fundamentally, we have to seek opportunities to embed that environmental dimension, because that has the finite limits, unlike the others. If we just move on, Jill, that'd be great. I mentioned the language earlier. I want to talk a little bit about the issues. Now, I work extensively with procurement professionals, have done for a number of years, and commissioners and procurement professionals tell me that actually there's all sorts of issues that just get thrown at us all the time. And actually, I agree. So what happens is any new legislation, any driver, it gets pushed towards a procurement professional and say, how are you embedding modern slavery? How are you embedding carbon reduction? How are you embedding EDI? How are you protecting us from risk alongside the security of supply? And what this slide does is highlights the sheer range of issues that we could include in the social value context. It's by no means all the issues, and not every one of them is relevant to a particular purchase, goods, services, or works, or both. But this is the landscape we're talking about. And once again, the challenge with this is, and I'm showing you this on purpose to say, look, it could be overwhelming. So the trick and that Jill's going to come on to a social value procurement perspective, is how do we recognise this whole, but then bring it down to what is manageable within the contract, and therefore what we're asking for as part of the tender. So there's a myriad of issues. There's a complexity of language. Our trick as commissioners is to actually say, well, yeah, we recognise that, but how do we bring it down? And I'll emphasise that a little bit more further on. If we can just move on, Jill, that'd be great. So in terms of social value and sustainability, I believe they're the same thing. It's about how, as part of our commissioning, do we actually reduce the environmental impact of the goods, services or works we're providing, or the projects that we're commissioning. How do we reduce the environmental impact? Because as I've already mentioned, that's fundamental. But also, how do we enhance the social and economic value we bring? And so every project we approach, every tender, everything we do within that commissioning context is a process of saying, right, what are the environmental, social, economic impacts of this project? How over time do we actually reduce any negative impacts or enhance any positive impacts in terms of socio-economic? And by thinking in that way, that methodology of reducing any negatives, enhancing any positives, can actually lead us to focusing our activity, is my belief. And that's what I've seen working with some of the organisations that we've worked with. And if we just move on, Jill, that'd be great. So what this means is the relationship between sustainability and social value can happen at an organisational level. So how do we manage our negatives? And we all have them. And every project, every purchase is going to have a range of negative issues, often environmental, but can be social and certainly economic in terms of risk. But how do we try and reduce that whilst finding the positive contribution of the organisation or the procurement? And this balancing act is one of the most difficult things to do in some ways. But if we use the methodology and apply that consistently to the purchases, to the projects, to the commissions we're making, then we have something that's applicable all the time. And that's the key. So it's not just an issue. It's not just how do we improve recycling. It has to be relevant, as Jill will come on to the subject matter of the contract and the opportunity that is there. So this balance between reducing the negative and enhancing the positive, I find, keeps it really simple for me when I'm looking at an organisation, looking at a project, looking at what I'm purchasing. So that balance is key. And if we just move on, Jill, that'd be great. So where do we start? And what I've tried to do in this brief introduction is to say that actually I've tried to highlight a little bit of the language and the sphere of concern. And the sphere of concern is the SDGs, them global impacts that I've recognised and have targets against at an international level, at a planetary level. But actually, I'm aware of them, but I can't do anything to solve all those problems. So what I'm doing as part of the procurement process, as part of commissioning, is saying, right, well, where I'm able to influence. So what's my sphere of influence? And as part of the process, we need to think about that. And that will relate to the subject matter of the contract, the spend, and other areas that Jill will pick up on, no doubt. But the absolute key is to start where we are. So for every project, every piece of work, understanding what the environmental, social, economic impacts and opportunities are associated with that, and choosing the most appropriate. We cannot solve all of the social value problems, all the sustainability problems in one go, but what we can do is take the appropriate steps through the commissioning cycle to have that positive impact. And that's the story we tell. That's the story we tell as an organisation of how we've intelligently understand the challenge, but we're focusing where we can have the real impact. And that might be small, and it's not always economic. It can be environmental, and it might happen. The impact we're having might not transpire for a number of years in terms of its contribution, but that focus is really important. And just move on, Jill. So for me to finish before I hand over to Jill, just to say that I tried to rattle through some of the basics there. It's obviously a very detailed subject, but I hope that was useful, and I will now keep quiet. Jill.
Thank you, Jimmy. Hopefully that was useful. I think it's really interesting. We spend a lot of time with procurement professionals and the marketplace, as you know, in both our respective businesses and roles. And I think I always really like the slide of that sphere of concern, sphere of influence, and sphere of control, because it can feel super overwhelming, I think, for all of us, because social value is a broad brush topic. And it's very subjective and it can be very localized. And so whatever role you're in, knowing where to start and not being overwhelmed by it is useful advice and guidance, I think. And thinking about how you distill from the bigger picture, the macro level down into micro level is important. I'm going to try and take us on the next bit of the journey, which is around the procurement context. So what you'll see on screen are sets of legislation, which we'll probably all be familiar with. Jimmy talked about the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. There is a link there to the UN SDGs if you want to have a look at them in more detail. And actually, if you do want to use the SDGs to help build your social value approach or narrative, we do have a planning tool that we use in Go for Growth. So if anybody would like to have that, it's just Excel based, but it can help you distill a goal like no poverty into something that might be relevant and proportionate to your organisation. Those things might already exist, but it's there if it's helpful. What I would say is that social value has been increasing in priority in the public sector over the last few years. The Public Services Act of 2012 was assented to law in January 2013, over 11 years ago now. So none of this is new necessarily. The Procurement Act obviously is. It's not in place yet. Carbon Net Zero 2050 is there, but the Public Services Act, the Social Value Act, isn't a new piece of legislation. And I'm going to try and cover essentially what it's trying to achieve. So it is there to try and help us in procurement to direct spending towards the achievement of that wider social, economic and environmental goals. And there are some constructs that are helpful to that. So the recent change of most economically advantageous tender to most advantageous tender. It can feel like a terminology change depending on how you currently procure, but it is underpinning that procurement doesn't have to be just about the fiscal. So no procurement person will ever apologise for worrying about the money, nor should we. This is public purse territory. But what the Social Value Act and what Meet versus Matt is trying to say is that this is about the broader value for money piece, how public procurement can be used strategically and operationally to benefit communities, creating training, employment opportunities, supporting local businesses, and obviously the environmental sustainability part. And so it's about that value for money piece being broader. So rather than just focusing on the narrow core of a contract, factoring in that social value consideration allows buyers and commissioners to think about the long-term value and the long-term costs and implications to society that could come as a result from procurement decisions if we make them in a different way with a social focus on them. And it does, of course, help us fulfil those obligations that are alive and well around governmental obligations, policy obligations, around health building, wealth building, local inequalities, community development, climate emergency, etc. So it helps us to meet those broader policy goals, both at national and at local level. And there is a legal requirement, obviously, to consider social value in public contracts. And the word consider is always a bit of a contentious one for me as a procurement practitioner. But the Public Services Act places a duty on us as procurement and commissioners to consider the social impact of every pound of taxpayers' money that we're spending. How will we commission? What will we buy? How are we using those budgets in a responsible, ethical and sustainable way? But one of the things I think we've seen change a little over recent years are the weightings to social value in procurements. So we're seeing up to around 20% weightings now in procurement. So it is true for the marketplace that social value can in fact be bid winning. And of course, as we know, if something is bid winning, the alter ego could also be bid losing. And the Procurement Act our new regulations coming to force on the 28th of October. We see no reason with the change in government at the minute. There's no comms to say that would shift at all. The Procurement Act comes into play on the 28th of October, and there is a real emphasis on social value in the Act, as well as flexibility, transparency, and actually a real drive to modernise procurement processes. And the Act itself aims for contracting authorities to act with integrity. That is not new news. To treat suppliers equitably, to promote a fair and green and innovative procurement process. And some of the constructs in Procurement Act 23, like the competitive flexible procedure, are really trying to underpin some of that. The government's intention to create a procurement system that's not only transparent but also adaptable, allowing for that competitive, flexible approach in selecting suppliers based on that most advantageous tender rather than solely on economic criteria, again, underpins that we have a broad role to play, and a unique role to play, I think, in procurement in terms of creating impact. And furthermore, as we get to know the Act in more detail, as everyone's going through deep dives at the minute in public sector or going through the modular procurement training through the Government Commercial College, we'll see that the Act is mandating that greater transparency throughout the whole procurement life cycle, including there's a requirement to publish information on supplier performance. And that really aligns with that broader objective that procurement activity can contribute positively to society and the economy as a whole. And you'll be aware of, no doubt, if you're joining us on the call today from a public sector procurement role, you'll be familiar with the National Procurement Policy Statement. So the last one was issued in May 24, although it is worth noting that's unapproved through Parliament at this point. So I think the general election placed a halt on anything going through. So it is just going through that approval process at the minute. But there is a question for me, I think, do we think that our suppliers are familiar with the legislative drivers around social value, the Public Services Act and the Procurement Act and the National Procurement Policy Statement? And there's a secondary question for me to my procurement colleagues on the call in terms of, should they be aware of it? Should we be guiding our suppliers to understanding the legislative drivers in more detail? And I'm going to explore just a couple of things. So there are 5 core parts of the National Procurement Policy Statement. I'm going to think about social value and small to medium enterprises. So social value is embedded in the last National Procurement Policy Statement. There's a bit of a change in there, but not particularly new news. So it's looking at where it's relevant to the subject matter of the contract and it's proportionate to do so. It's thinking about how we, through procurement, create resilient businesses and opportunities for quality employment and skills development, improve innovation, improve supply chain resilience, and improve the security of supply, and also tackle climate change and reduce waste. And of course, there are a number of ways that contracting authorities can implement those outcomes. So that might be how we structure the procurement or carry the procurement process out. That might be how we embed social value in the specification. And I'm having lots of conversations about undisclosed criteria at the minute. So if we have social value outcomes that we want to be able to award work against that, we must include it in the specification. We can't just put social value questions into a procurement where we haven't had some context around that in the specification that connects the two. And we need to be really cognizant of that. Where it can be beneficial to consider those additional benefits, achieving them without overburdening the supplier or the bidding community is really crucial according to the National Procurement Policy Statement. So contracting authorities should ensure, wherever practicable to do so, that we do not place onerous requirements on suppliers or use disproportionate clauses in tenders and contracts. And I think that segues nicely into what is a new piece of text in the National Procurement Policy Statement on small to medium enterprises. And it actually says quite specifically that SMEs are the backbone of our economy, and it's therefore vital that contracting authorities can support businesses to achieve sustainable growth, and that we open up public procurement opportunities to more SMEs and more VCSEs, the voluntary community and social enterprise sector, because that's the way that we'll create a thriving and competitive and diverse marketplace. And the NPPS says that SMEs not only play a role play a key role in communities by providing a local service and employment, but also are the root of innovation, actually. Lots of innovative solutions can come out of that small business community. And I don't know if anyone is familiar with the statistics on how big this small business community is, but there's 5.5 million businesses in the UK. 99.3% of them are classified as small. That's 0 to 49 employees. If you think about SMEs, 0 to 249 employees using the ONS data, they're responsible for a little over 60% of all turnover and a little over 50% of all the employment. So this is a super tanker community. And what the NPPS is calling for is that, and it all counts under the social value umbrella, what the NPPS is really calling for contracting authorities to do is to ensure through their approach to procurement that that playing field is levelled for SMEs and VCSEs and startups so that there is equitable opportunity to compete in public procurement. And the duty is not just to consider what those barriers to SMEs might be, but also to take reasonable steps to remove those barriers going forward. Just to create a little bit of context around this, so Go for Growth did a survey with YPO about 18 months ago where we polled 150 buyers. And we asked them what their biggest concerns were around the route to awarding work to SMEs. And what you can see on screen is that those buyers said that 64% of those 150 said that they had a lack of confidence in the supplier capability to be able to go through the bid process in and of itself. So interestingly, not necessarily a concern that SMEs can deliver what's required, but that actually being able to award the work to them because of either the volume or quality of bid submissions just wasn't there. So 64% of buyers stated that it was the highest concern that came back through that poll. But also suppliers agree, 79% of suppliers that we talk to, and I'll mention this a number of times probably during the webinar, we're supporting in excess of 11,000 businesses at any given point, and we've amassed over 36,000 individual engagements with businesses. And so we're always asking businesses what their barriers or their view of barriers and challenges are. And 79% of businesses in a recent poll that we did said that they need help to develop their bid skills. What that tells us is that those two communities that certainly Go for Growth is trying to connect, they agree with each other. And what that means from a social value perspective, from a procurement context, is if we don't remove that barrier very comprehensively, we will continue to struggle to award work to SMEs. And therefore, we will struggle to deliver some of that inherent social value capability that we've got. So we should think about what we can do about it. And I've got a slide on some things that we can do in terms of removing barriers to SMEs. But on social value and sustainability, for example, 71% of those 150 buyers that we polled said that social value and sustainability would have the single greatest impact on their organisation's strategy. So it's really high up everyone's agenda in terms of the context of that survey that we did. And 56% of the marketplace providers that we talk to, and there's a fairly equitable split in that marketplace in terms of those that are, have done some level of work in the public sector but are looking to grow, and some that have never tried this before. It's 47% have not started there yet. 53% are already working in the public sector but wish to grow and having different levels of success. But what we see again is that the two communities have got some level of agreement, but also some tension in that last stat. So this is our single biggest, most impactful strategically area for our organisations, those 150 buyers said. But 56% of the marketplace that we're talking to said, actually, we need some help to put that narrative together. And we see that manifest in two different ways. So some don't know where to get started, and some are doing lots of social value stuff, might recognise it as social value, might not, due to some of the language things that Jimmy talked about, but actually need help putting that narrative together. So we've got both of those at play. So I'm not going to pick everything out from this slide. I'm just going to pick a few things out. What can you do to deliver social value through removing barriers for SMEs? So you can talk to the market, and the more the better. The market says to us, more is more. We understand that things will change. We understand that your pipeline will move around, that funding changes, but talk to us early, talk to us as much as you can. This will help you develop your specification, your procurement processes. And we have got notices around pre-market engagement. So, it comes under more scrutiny under the Procurement Act as well. So we know that there's an evolution in there. But, talking to the market is really important under Procurement Act. And we won't know the answer to this yet. But if you are going to use the competitive flexible procedure, because it can have so much variation in it, over time, the more you can let the market know how you might be using that competitive flexible procedure before you invoke the timescales would be super useful. And I want to pick out pipelines. The National Procurement Policy Statement talks about pipelines. The Procurement Act itself enshrines pipelines in the Act, and the Act says that 2 million is the level. If you're thinking about social value through SMEs, for example, very few SMEs are going to be, and certainly in the micro, small sole trader end of the market, they might be up towards the medium end. Not many are going to be at 2 million. You're probably looking definitely below threshold, maybe up to around a maximum of 250,000 for the masses of that community. So think about what you're doing with your pipeline. Are you letting businesses know about your lower value opportunities? Because those organisations still need time to prepare like everybody else does. And especially if partnership or consortia type approach will be involved. So the Cardiff University Business School, we do a lot of work with on collaboration. They say that it's at least 6 months to prepare for a bid in a consortia or collaboration partnership type arrangement. So even in the lower end of that pipeline, your marketplace needs better and more communications and early communications. Baselining your SME spend is really important. If you don't know what today looks like, moving on to tomorrow can be really different. And then the only other thing I think I would pick out of there for now is that this isn't all about direct engagement with the marketplace. Your principal contractors, tier 1 through to tier 2, tier 3, etc., are just as important. And the responsibility we have in procurement to make sure that contractually that social local value can be delivered through that tiered contract is really important also. So if we think about embedding social value, I mentioned that we are looking at the SIPS procurement cycle. So we go through the three phases: the pre-procurement stage, sourcing stage, and then the contract and supplier management stage. What I've done is I've popped on screen the procurement stage. So again, I'm not going to talk through everything that's on the screen, but because time was tight, I wanted to have it all on the slide. So you will get all of this as it comes out to you. But if we think about what can we do in our pre-procurement stages to embed social value, if we haven't got defined goals in our organisation, or even if we have, thinking about those organisations' social value goals and where they align potentially to the Sustainable Development Goals can be really important and useful in helping us to identify and embed in specification and evaluation criteria what it is that we're trying to achieve, the outcomes that we want from the procurement. And if we think about what I just said about talking to the market, we can ratify some of that in our pre-market engagement. That whole life cycle of social value is really important. So one of the things that Jimmy mentioned in his slides was we won't necessarily always realise the benefits straight away. So understanding the life cycle of that social value, and does it fit with the contract that we're putting out? A colleague of mine, Mike, always talks about if someone says they're going to plant a load of trees, you want to be able to see your trees. Well, of course, you can do that very tangibly from day one, but you won't necessarily see the fullness of that and for, many, many years afterwards. So thinking about that life cycle of social value, how long will it take? How long will a contract run for? And what happens to that social value at the end of the contract? And I think there are still some conflicts in how procurement is driven. So you might be seeing some tension in that need for best price and the associated savings, the very traditional things. And again, we don't apologise for that in procurement, but how do we balance off, as Jimmy said, the net positive effect that we can have from this procurement? And I don't think it has to be a quid pro quo. I don't think that we have to sacrifice one for the other. I'll always remember Joe Fairley from Green and Black saying that good business is good business. We don't have to sacrifice good commerciality for good social and environmental impact. The two can coexist in harmony, but it is a balancing act at times. And we are going to understand, or need to understand, the technical evaluation for social value. It should be core to the requirement, not just tagged on, or we do see in plenty of procurements where it's not scored. So we want you to contractually deliver lots of extra social impact, but we're not going to actually place a weighting on that. And that sends a message to the marketplace about actually how important social value is to you as an organisation. So think about how in those pre-procurement stages, you will define what the social value requirement is, how you will ratify that against the contract and the market maturity, and then how you will embed that into the procurement process going forward. And so if we think about the process, again, I won't pick it all out, but that clear and achievable social value criteria, and the key word for me is achievable in there. As we talked about, we should not be placing unduly burdensome requirements on our bidders, and especially on smaller organisations, and we shouldn't be using overcomplicated terminology or legal requirements either. So we should be thinking about whether our requirements are clear and achievable and the criteria is embedded in there, and make sure that we've done due diligence on that so that it's inclusive but compliant also with regulations and competition law. And then thinking about that evaluation process, how do we make sure that the solutions meet the social value need? The battles are won and lost, and I'll say this again when we move on, in contract management for sure. So we need to pay attention to any potential greenwashing or bidders paying lip service to social value. We need to look out for those detailed social value commitments and those that are backed up by evidence. So we have done this, we will do this, and this is how we will measure it, is useful in evaluation. And then thinking about actually how do we implement it? So how do we make sure that the winner of these competitions actually does what they've said they're going to do, testing those claims and holding the supplier to account? And the underlying message, of course, is that we are on the hook in procurement, even if we hand it over to a contract management team, of making sure that the contract that we're placing is in fact the one that gets implemented. And that includes the social value requirements that are in there. And then, as I said, in my view, and there'll be those that probably disagree with me, but in my view, contracts and supplier management is where these battles are absolutely won and lost. We can have a great tender if the implementation doesn't happen and we don't measure those things, then we might never actually realise the total social value of that contract. So think about those practices. They've got to be enduring throughout the life of the contract. Think about the economic impact. Have we got the right balance of administrative burden in there and those measurement regimes? We don't want to create cottage industries around measurement, but we do want to be able to see that what we said we were going to achieve is what we're actually achieving. But this is partnership, so we're not in an adversarial model any longer. We don't run procurement in that way anymore. So we will be asking ourselves throughout the life of that contract, how do we help and support our suppliers to really live a sustainable business? What's our skin in the game of that? What do we need to do in our relationship? What are our responsibilities? What are our behaviours? And if in the pre-procurement stage and in the sourcing stage, one of the sense checks, and Jimmy and I have talked about this many times, one of the sense checks is, have I got in my toolkit all the things that I'm asking my supplier to have? So if I'm asking for a water usage strategy from my supplier or a water conservation policy, are they policies and strategies that I have in my organisation? And if they're not, why am I asking for them? Are they things that I should be adopting? One of the ones that often comes up is living wage. So we'll ask all of our suppliers to pay the national living wage. Absolutely nothing wrong with that, as long as you're already paying it as well. And if you're not, that can create some conflict that could be difficult. And think about those performance measures. What are you using to measure the social value performance, and how reliable and accurate and timely is that data? So if we think about that life cycle, and we might not be realizing the benefit of the social impact for a number of months or years even, do the measures reflect that? And do they do that proportionately? And do they do that accurately? So we'll think around that life cycle. And then, of course, we should be thinking about how we end these relationships and how we move on to the next stage. And so that was a real whistle-stop tour of social value and procurement. I'll stop sharing my screen for a second. We haven't got anything in the chat or the Q&A that we can see at the minute. If there are any questions, please feel free to pop them in there just now. What I hope is that whilst that was quite high level and a fairly fast-paced trot through, that there were some really useful and helpful tips and thinking points and things for our colleagues to reflect on. If when you come off the call today, our contact details will be in with the slide deck when it comes out. So if there's anything that you want to know, or if you want to have a further conversation about social value, you can, of course, get in touch with either myself or Jimmy. That's not a problem. Jimmy, anything finally from you before we let everybody go about their very busy Thursdays, no doubt?
Yeah, I think only one thing I'd say is that just to remember that this is a learning process with the embedding of social value. The terminology, the policy, the sheer volume of issues is challenging for us all. And I think as long as we approach it with the suppliers with an acknowledgement that an understanding we're learning as well, I think that's the key for me. I've been working with procurement professionals and contract managers and suppliers, and as one, it's we need to have that transparency that we're all trying our best here, and how do we work to deliver it.
Well, and it is fluid, isn't it? It's not a project, so it has a beginning and it might have a middle at somewhere, but there isn't going to have an end, because this is a constant evolution. And you're right, we should forgive ourselves for finding this challenging, and you know, and it's big, and we won't always get it right, and that's okay. We don't have to always get it right, but there are constructs out there to help us do our best when we put our best foot forward.
Yeah.
And it's brilliant. We've had a comment about the sphere of control. So that's good. If even one person is going away with the ability to try a different way or to think about it in a different way, then
Can I just add one more thing, actually, Jill, as people are still on, and it's the challenge of sustainability and social value. I've seen over the years, and as has Jill, that this is just fundamentally part of being excellent at your job. So when we talk to young procurement professionals who are coming in, it's starting to be built into the thinking. And I think the only thing that I think we all need to take on board is this is just going to be business as usual. So when we're seeing that transition from it's not my job, it's extra, this is just part of it now. And I think if we approach it with just business excellence, and Jill made the point, which I wholeheartedly agree, an excellent business is a sustainable business. Excellent procurement is sustainable procurement, and that includes social value. It's just how we do it.
yeah, absolutely agree. There isn't procurement and sustainable procurement. There's only sustainable procurement. And you're right. That's the direction of travel, and it's absolutely appropriate that should be it. We've just got, with 1 minute to go, a request to know the panel's thoughts on the pressures of CSRD's exacting impact reporting requirements on global suppliers in the UK. The extent to which LAs will align their requirements. We're probably not going to have time to answer that, but what we'll do, like we said at the top of the webinar, we'll run through that and we'll pop some thoughts into the slide deck when it comes out. Usually we get them out within 48 hours. If you haven't had anything by Monday, it will be out to you by close of business Monday latest. So don't panic if it hasn't come by Monday morning. So all that remains for me and Jimmy to say is thank you ever so much for everyone for joining us. We know everyone's super busy, so we really appreciate it. We've got tons of webinars coming up for the rest of this year. So if we can be of any more help, please do get in touch. Thank you again, everyone. See you soon. Thanks, Jimmy.